Commander Elias Van stood inside the landing capsule as it trembled slightly under the pressure of atmospheric entry, the metal walls humming like a strained heartbeat. And in that tight space, he felt something deeper than routine fear, because this was not just another mission. It was the moment everything he believed about his life began to break apart in real time. And he did not yet know it fully, but his entire expedition had already been decided without him, treated like a tool that could be discarded the moment it stopped being useful. While above him in orbit, the command ship remained silent for too long, and that silence was already the first sign that something was wrong, though Elias still told himself it was standard procedure, just another controlled descent onto an unverified world beyond human-charted space. A planet that had been detected through distant scans, showing impossible energy readings and massive atmospheric stability, the kind of world corporations and military coalitions dreamed about because it meant expansion, resources, and control. But Elias had always known those dreams came with hidden costs, and yet he still signed up because he believed in exploration, in contact, in responsibility, or at least that was what he told himself to justify leaving behind a quieter life on Earth. And now, as the capsule's outer cameras flickered to life, he saw the surface below for the first time, and it was not what any simulation had prepared him for. Because the terrain stretched too wide, the structures too tall, and movement in the distance was not human, not even close, but something enormous and graceful, silhouettes like giants moving through glowing fields of silver vegetation that bent without breaking. And before he could even process what he was seeing, a voice crackled through his internal comlink, calm and detached, belonging to Captain Harrow, the man who had personally selected him for this mission, the man Elias had once trusted without question. And Harrow's words arrived not as conversation, but as confirmation of something already decided, stating that the descent was proceeding as planned, that Elias should maintain protocol. And then, after a brief pause that felt heavier than it should, Harrow added in an almost casual tone that Elias's status had been updated to expendable if conditions required it. And for a moment, Elias thought he had misheard because military language often softened meaning. But then, Harrow continued, explaining that Elias was the most efficient choice for initial contact risk assessment, since no valuable personnel should be endangered in unknown biological zones. And suddenly the capsule felt smaller, not physically but conceptually, like the world outside had expanded while his own importance had shrunk to nothing. And Elias asked for clarification, keeping his voice controlled. But Harrow only repeated that it was not personal, only strategic necessity, and in that instant Elias understood the truth that had been hidden behind layers of formal mission language. He was not the commander of this descent. He was the test subject, the disposable piece sent forward to confirm whether the world below was safe enough for others to follow. And as this realization settled into him like cold metal sinking through water, the capsule finally broke through the last layer of cloud, revealing the planet's surface in full clarity. And there, waiting below, were the beings that would change everything, because they were not distant figures or vague shapes anymore, but towering alien women moving with deliberate precision across the landscape, their forms so large that entire trees only reached their lower legs, their presence casting shifting shadows over vast, glowing plains, and instead of chaos or hostility, there was order in the way they moved, as if they had been expecting something, and then the capsule's landing system triggered automatically, forcing descent without further input, and Elias realized too late that orbit control had been overridden, meaning Harrow had already finalized the plan without telling him. And as the capsule touched down with a controlled impact, the landing doors began to open, slow and mechanical, revealing the alien world in full sensory detail, air that felt clean but heavy with unfamiliar energy, light that bent in unusual angles, and sound that carried too far. And standing just beyond the capsule was the closest of the giants, a woman so large that even her lowered posture placed her face far above the capsule roof. Her expression calm, but intensely focused, and Elias instinctively stepped back, his training preparing for threat response. But there was no aggression, only observation. And then she spoke, her voice resonating through the ground itself, not loud in volume, but deep in structure. And though he did not understand her language, the ship's automated translator activated late, rendering her words into something simple and startling, calling him a miniature being, not with mockery but with recognition, as if he was something known, something expected. And that single phrase made Elias's mind struggle to adapt faster than fear could form, because nothing in his mission briefing had mentioned contact protocols with civilizations of this scale or perception of humans as something so small. And yet the giants did not move to harm him. Instead, they stepped closer with extreme care, as if afraid he might break. And one of them lowered a hand slowly near the capsule, stopping short of contact, while others gathered behind her in a semicircle of silent observation. And Elias, still processing Harrow's betrayal, now faced an even stranger contradiction, because the beings that should have been terrifying were treating him with caution and reverence. And in the back of his mind, Harrow's words echoed again, expendable, and he realized something bitter about human arrogance, that his own species had assumed dominance everywhere they might go. Yet here he was not even a presence in their scale of reality. And the lead giant woman spoke again, repeating the translated phrase, miniature being, followed by a tone that the system interpreted as acknowledgement or recognition. And though Elias did not yet understand it, he had just been labeled not as intruder or enemy, but as something sacred or significant within their belief structure. And that misunderstanding would become the foundation of everything that followed. Because as Elias stood at the threshold of the capsule door, torn between stepping forward into an unknown world or retreating into the broken certainty of betrayal above, he felt the weight of two realities pressing against him at once. One where he was nothing more than a disposable asset discarded by his own people, and another where he was something unprecedented in the eyes of beings far beyond human scale. And in that moment the choice was not yet clear. But the consequences of stepping forward were already beginning to form, because whatever awaited him on this planet was not just survival or contact, but a complete rewriting of what it meant to exist in a universe where size, power, and meaning itself were not what he had always believed. And as the giant woman extended her presence closer without touching him, as if offering both space and recognition at once, Elias realized that the mission he thought he was on had already ended before he even landed. And something far more complex had begun, one that would force him to confront. Not on Elias Ven's first full day on the alien planet felt less like arrival and more like displacement from reality itself, because nothing around him behaved according to human expectation, not the scale of the land, not the rhythm of movement, not even the way time seemed to stretch differently under the vast sky. And yet what disturbed him most was not the giants themselves, but the silence of his own people. Because after the capsule landing and Harrow's final transmission, no rescue signal came, no clarification, no correction, only controlled silence from orbit that confirmed what Elias already understood in his bones. He had been abandoned in a controlled operation disguised as exploration. And as he stood at the base of a landing structure, watching the enormous alien women move with careful precision around him, he realized that humanity had not sent him here to succeed, but to disappear if things went wrong. And that thought stayed with him as the giants began to interact with him, not with aggression, but with what could only be described as ritualized caution. Because they never approached too fast, never spoke too loudly, and always adjusted their movements as if his presence was fragile beyond comprehension. And they called him again and again the same phrase that the translator rendered as miniature being, but the tone carried respect, not insult, as if he was a recognized category in their ancient understanding of existence. And this contradiction unsettled Elias deeply, because he had expected fear or hostility or at least indifference, not reverence. And over the next hours, he was escorted through landscapes that felt too large for his senses to properly process, pathways that stretched like rivers between glowing structures, and he noticed that even their cities were built with intentional emptiness around his position, as if the entire environment had been redesigned to avoid overwhelming him. And that level of consideration forced him to confront a strange discomfort, because he was used to being either in control or being threatened. But here he was neither. He was protected, observed, and carefully integrated into a system that treated him as significant without explanation. And while this happened, the memory of Captain Harrow's voice kept resurfacing, especially the way he had spoken about expendability, as if Elias's life was a variable in an equation rather than a human existence. And that memory slowly transformed inside him from shock into something colder, something structured, something dangerous. Because betrayal does not stay emotional forever. It evolves into calculation, and Elias began to think not just about what had been done to him, but how it had been done, what systems allowed a commander to be discarded so easily, and what consequences such systems deserved. And this is where the seed of revenge began to grow, not as rage, but as focus, because Elias realized that Harrow had not acted alone. There was a structure behind him, a chain of command that valued efficiency over loyalty, and Elias had been placed at the bottom of that chain, meaning his survival was irrelevant, but his awareness was not. And that distinction mattered because awareness allowed planning, and planning allowed correction, and correction, in Elias's mind, began to take the shape of eventual payback. But he did not act yet, because he needed understanding first, and the aliens unknowingly gave him access to it, as they allowed him to observe their systems, their communication networks, and their planetary infrastructure under the assumption that he was sacred and incapable of harm. And this trust became the most dangerous weapon available to him. Because while they saw him as a miniature being worthy of protection, he saw pathways into structures that even they treated with ritual respect. And during one of these escorted journeys, he met Serapha, a guardian figure whose presence was both immense and calming. And she was the first to speak to him not as a category, but as something closer to curiosity, asking through imperfect translation why his energy felt divided. And Elias almost answered honestly, almost told her about betrayal, about orbit, about Harrow's decision. But he stopped himself because trust was a resource he no longer spent freely. And instead he gave half-truths, saying only that his people were far away and uncertain. And Serapha accepted this without pressure, though her eyes suggested she understood more than she revealed. And over the following cycles, Elias learned the rhythm of their society, how they treated him as both guest and symbol, how their myths seemed to align with his presence in ways he did not yet understand, because they believe in a concept of returned miniature emissaries who carried imbalance and correction into civilizations. And Elias slowly realized that they were interpreting his arrival through an ancient belief system that predated human contact, which meant his presence was not random to them. It was expected, and that expectation gave him an unexpected advantage, because belief creates access, and access creates opportunity, and opportunity is what revenge needs to survive. And so Elias began quietly mapping everything, not with tools, but with observation, memorizing guard rotations, energy pulses, structural weaknesses, communication patterns, and more importantly, emotional patterns of trust, because he noticed something critical about the giants. They did not understand deception in the way humans did. They understood danger and protection, but not manipulation, and this made them predictable in a way that Elias found both comforting and disturbing, because it meant he could exploit their trust if he ever chose to. And that thought lingered in him longer than he expected, especially during moments when Serapha would lower herself near him in quiet conversation, her voice steady and protective, telling him that no harm would come to him while he remained under their vow. And each time she said this, Elias felt a conflict rising inside him, because part of him wanted to believe it, wanted to accept this strange protection and forget Harrow's betrayal. But another part of him refused, because forgiveness without accountability felt like surrender, and Elias had never been someone who surrendered easily. So instead he built two versions of himself internally, one that adapted to this new world of giants and reverence, and another that continued planning the return to human space, where Harrow would still be alive, still holding authority, still believing Elias was gone. And that imbalance of knowledge became Elias's quiet weapon, because he now had information both about the alien world and about human intent, And information is what turns helplessness into leverage. But the deeper he went into this dual existence, the more unstable his emotions became. Because the giants were not cruel, they were not oppressive, they were gentle in ways that contrasted sharply with human betrayal. And that contrast began to erode the simplicity of his revenge. Because how do you justify destruction when you are being protected by the very beings you might exploit? And this moral tension intensified when he intercepted a fragmented transmission again from orbit, Harrow speaking to unknown command officials about resource extraction and planetary compliance, treating the alien world as property to be harvested once Elias's role was complete. And hearing this confirmed something inside him, that the betrayal was not personal but systemic. And that made it worse because systems are harder to punish than individuals. And yet Elias's mind still returned to Harrow as the face of that system, because faces are easier to target than structures. And so revenge began to take shape again, sharper now, more precise, no longer emotional but strategic. And as he stood one night beneath the alien sky, surrounded by beings who saw him as sacred, Elias understood that he was now living inside two worlds at once, one that worshipped him without understanding him, and one that discarded him without hesitation. And between those two extremes, he was slowly becoming something neither side fully controlled. And that transformation was the most dangerous part of all, because once a person learns they can be both insignificant and powerful at the same time, every choice becomes a question of consequence. And Elias was now approaching the point where he would have to decide whether to use the trust of giants as a shield or as a weapon, and that decision was forming quietly inside him, even before he was ready to admit it existed. Why the betrayal of Captain Harrow, but also the uncomfortable possibility that he might no longer understand his own place in the universe at all. The day the sky changed, Elias Van knew the waiting had ended, because the alien world that had treated him like a sacred miniature being suddenly shifted its attention upward in unison, as if the entire planet had sensed something arriving beyond the atmosphere. And when he stepped out into the open field near Serapha's towering presence, he saw it clearly for the first time. The human ship returning from orbit, massive, metallic, familiar in design but cold in intention, hovering above the clouds like a judgment that had finally come back to collect its debt. And even before the communication channel opened, Elias already felt Captain Harrow's presence in it, because some voices carry betrayal even before words are spoken. And then the transmission activated, and Harrow's tone was exactly as Elias remembered, controlled, confident, and entirely detached from emotion, as if nothing had changed, as if Elias had not spent days on a planet being studied, protected, and redefined by beings far beyond human scale. And Harrow spoke first not with concern but with ownership, saying that extraction procedures were now active and that Elias's survival was no longer relevant to mission parameters. And hearing those words again did something different to Elias this time, because the shock had already burned away, leaving behind something sharper and more stable. And around him the giants reacted immediately, sensing the change in atmospheric pressure and orbital movement, their defensive structures awakening across the landscape like vast sleeping systems opening their eyes. And Serapha moved closer to Elias, her enormous form lowering slightly, not in dominance, but in protection, asking through translation if the sky threat was connected to him. And Elias looked up at the ship hovering above the clouds and understood that this was the moment where everything would split into two paths, one leading to destruction and one leading to consequence. Because inside the human vessel, Harrow was preparing what he believed was a simple operation, a controlled sweep to secure resources and silence unknown interference, still convinced that Elias had either died or become irrelevant. And that arrogance gave Elias something dangerous, an opening, because arrogance always assumes control, and control is what creates vulnerability when it breaks. And as the ship's systems began scanning the planet, Elias realized that the giants were not responding with panic, but with structured defense, their entire civilization adjusting like a single coordinated organism. And in that moment, Elias understood the real difference between the two worlds, because humanity had sent him here as expendable, but these beings had already accepted him as something worth protecting without needing utility as justification. And that contradiction began to weigh heavily on him as Harrow's voice returned again, issuing final instructions to begin compliance sweep, and the sky above them began to fracture with light as orbital weapons systems powered up. And that was when Elias felt the true pressure of revenge rise again inside him, because now he had both the means and the justification to destroy everything that had wronged him, and the hidden override he had embedded in the human ship's communication relay during earlier transmission access was still active, a command that could destabilize their orbital systems and turn their own weapon network against them. And for a brief moment, Elias saw it clearly: the end of Harrow, the collapse of the command structure, the satisfaction of turning betrayal back onto itself. And that vision felt clean, almost relieving, like closing a wound that had been open too long. But then Serapha spoke again, her voice lower than before, not commanding but steady, telling him that he was safe under their vow and that no sky machine would harm him while they still stood. And Elias realized something uncomfortable in that moment, because the giants were not just protecting him physically, they were trusting him emotionally. And trust is a fragile thing when placed in the hands of someone who has already been broken by betrayal. And above them, the human ship began initiating its sweep sequence, energy signatures forming like a tightening net across the atmosphere. And Elias understood that if he did nothing, the planet would suffer, not necessarily in destruction, but in exploitation, because Harrow's mission was never peaceful contact. It was extraction under control, and that meant the giants would eventually be reduced to resources studied, contained, or removed. And that realization created a second layer of anger inside him, because now the revenge was not only personal, it was tied to protection of something that had never harmed him. And this is where Elias's conflict reached its peak, because revenge no longer belonged to a simple idea of payback. It had become a decision about which future would exist. And so he stood there between Serapha's protective presence and the burning sky above, while Harrow's voice continued issuing commands that sounded like inevitability. And Elias accessed the hidden system link one final time, preparing to trigger the override that would turn human weapons against their own command ship. And in his mind, he saw the consequences unfold: Harrow's authority collapsing instantly, the ship losing control, human forces being forced to retreat or burn in their own systems. And for a moment, Elias allowed himself to feel what satisfaction might look like. But it did not come cleanly, because alongside it came images of Serapha and the others, not as enemies, but as beings who had treated him with care he had not earned. And that thought created friction inside him that no amount of anger could fully suppress, because revenge demands clarity, and clarity demands simplicity. But Elias no longer lived in a simple situation, and as he hovered over the activation command, Serapha knelt slightly beside him, lowering her massive head closer, so her voice could be heard clearly, asking him not what he would do to the sky, but what the sky had done to him. And that question pierced deeper than any weapon, because it forced him to confront the truth that revenge had been built on pain, but also on interpretation. And interpretation can be wrong, incomplete, or outdated. And Elias realized that what Harrow had done was betrayal. Yes, but it was also part of a system that would continue even if Harrow disappeared, meaning that destroying one ship would not end the cycle. It would only create retaliation, escalation, and more suffering, and that understanding did not remove his anger, but it complicated it enough to slow his hand. And above them, the human ship began its final approach for compliance enforcement, unaware that the planet below was not defenseless, and unaware that Elias was no longer just a target, but a decision point. And in that final moment before irreversible action, Elias made a choice that even surprised him, because instead of activating the destructive override, he shifted access and triggered a containment protocol he had quietly studied from the giant systems, merging alien defensive logic with human signal pathways, creating a non-lethal planetary lock that would disable the ship's weapons and engines without destroying it. And as the command executed across both systems, the human vessel suddenly stuttered in orbit, its weapons going dark mid-charge, its engines locking into controlled drift, and Harrow's voice cut through the channel again. But this time it carried something unfamiliar, uncertainty, because control had been removed without warning. And as the ship became immobilized in the sky like a suspended weight, Elias finally spoke into the open channel, his voice steady but no longer obedient, telling Harrow that expendability was a choice they had made about him. But consequences were a reality they could no longer avoid. And then he closed the transmission, and the silence that followed was heavier than any explosion, because nothing had been destroyed, yet everything had changed, and the giants around him did not cheer or react with celebration. They simply observed, as if witnessing a correction rather than a victory, and Serapha placed her hand near him again, not touching but close enough to shield, and asked softly what he had done. And Elias looked at the frozen ship above the sky, and understood that he had not taken revenge in the way he once imagined, because he had not erased Harrow or destroyed the system. Instead, he had removed its certainty, its control, and its ability to act without consequence. And in doing so, he had created something more complicated than satisfaction, because revenge would have ended a story, but restraint had begun a new one where Elias was no longer just a victim or a weapon, but a force that decided outcomes without becoming destruction itself. And as the sky remained still and the giants continued their silent watch, Elias finally accepted that the real consequence of betrayal was not the urge to destroy, but the responsibility to choose what should survive after anger had its chance to speak.